The scent of fresh coffee filled the air as Emily wiped down the counter, her hands moving in a practiced rhythm. Another long shift at the diner, another day of watching people rush in and out of a life she could only dream of. She had always imagined something bigger for herself, something more than taking orders and scraping by on tips. But life had a way of keeping her grounded, reminding her that dreams were for people who could afford them. That was until he walked in. At first glance, Daniel Sterling didn't stand out in the crowded diner. He wasn't the type to flaunt his wealth, no designer suits, no expensive jewelry, just a confident presence, a quiet kind of power in the way he carried himself. He took a seat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and watched Emily with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She had served thousands of customers, but none had ever looked at her like that. Their conversation was effortless, as if they had known each other forever. Day after day he came back, always choosing the same seat, always leaving a generous tip. Emily didn't know much about him, only that he was successful, kind, and unlike anyone she had ever met. And then, out of nowhere, he asked her to dinner. One date turned into two, then three. Within weeks, Daniel had swept Emily into a world she never thought she'd belong to. Elegant restaurants, spontaneous weekend getaways, gifts she could never imagine affording. It was a fairy tale, one that felt almost too good to be true. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, he proposed. People warned her. They said it was too fast, too reckless. But Daniel made her feel safe, cherished, like she was finally stepping into the life she had always deserved. She said yes without hesitation. The wedding was small, intimate, just close friends and a handful of people from Daniel's world. Emily felt like the luckiest woman alive. 7 days later, she would realize how wrong she was. The first sign was small, almost insignificant. A locked room in their house, one Daniel never mentioned. Then there were the late-night phone calls, the way his expression darkened when she asked too many questions. And finally, the moment that changed everything. One night, unable to fight her curiosity, Emily did something she had promised herself she wouldn't. She followed Daniel, and what she saw, it made her blood run cold. Her perfect husband wasn't who he claimed to be. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind the hedge, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the cold metal of the gate. Daniel had left the house just after midnight, slipping out without a word. She had watched from the bedroom window as his car disappeared down the long, winding driveway. It wasn't like him to leave without telling her, at least not until recently. She had spent the last few nights lying awake, replaying the moments that didn't add up, the way he tensed whenever she asked about his past, the way he avoided answering simple questions about his business, the way he dismissed her curiosity with a charming smile and a kiss, as if that would be enough to make her forget. But tonight, she needed answers. She had followed his car at a safe distance, her hands trembling on the wheel as she navigated the dark, empty roads. The route was unfamiliar, leading her far from the city, past quiet neighborhoods, and into an industrial part of town she had never been to before. When Daniel finally pulled into a dimly lit building at the end of a dead-end street, she parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way on foot. Now, hidden in the shadows, she watched as he stepped inside. A few seconds later, the heavy steel door locked behind him. The building looked abandoned. No signs, no windows, no movement. Just silence. Emily's skin prickled. Something about this place felt wrong. She moved closer, pressing her ear against the cold surface of the door, straining to hear any sound from inside. At first there was nothing, just the hum of the street lamp flickering above her. Then, voices, low, hushed, urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill down her spine. Daniel wasn't alone. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was this a business deal? A secret meeting? Or something worse? A sudden noise made her jump. Footsteps, heavy and fast. Someone was coming. Panicked, she ducked behind a stack of wooden crates just as the door swung open. She held her breath as two men stepped outside, their faces partially hidden in the dim light. And then she saw him. Daniel. But the man beside him, the one who clapped him on the shoulder, speaking in a hushed, serious tone, was someone she recognized, someone she never expected to see here. And in that moment, Emily realized she didn't just need to know Daniel's secret. She needed to know if she was in danger. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears as she shrank further into the shadows, her body rigid with fear. But there was no mistaking the man standing next to Daniel. It was James Carter. She hadn't seen him in years, not since the diner, back when he would show up late at night, slipping into a corner booth and watching her like he knew something she didn't. He had always unsettled her, though she could never explain why. There was something about the way he carried himself, like he was used to being feared. And now here he was, standing side by side with her husband. Emily forced herself to stay calm, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. James wasn't just some random customer from her past. He was dangerous. She had heard rumors, whispers among the regulars at the diner. Some said he was involved in things no one dared to talk about. Others claimed he had disappeared for a while, only to resurface when things went wrong for the wrong people. But what was he doing with Daniel? The two men spoke in hushed tones, their words just out of reach. James handed Daniel a small envelope, and whatever was inside made Daniel tense. He hesitated before nodding, slipping it into his pocket like it was something he wished he could throw away. Emily barely had time to process the exchange before James's gaze flickered toward the street. She ducked lower, heart pounding as his sharp eyes scanned the area. He was looking for something. No, someone. Had they sensed her presence? She needed to leave. Now carefully she took a step back, pressing herself against the crates. But as she moved, her foot knocked against a loose piece of metal. The sharp clatter echoed in the night. Silence. Then, movement. Did you hear that? James's voice was sharp, alert. Emily's breath hitched as Daniel turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. For the first time since she met him, she saw something in his expression that terrified her. Not love, not kindness, something colder, something she never expected. And in that moment, she realized the truth. She didn't know the man she had married, and if she wasn't careful, she might not live long enough to find out who he really was. Emily's heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. She pressed herself tighter against the crates, forcing herself to stay still, barely daring to breathe. Footsteps, slow at first, deliberate, then quicker, more urgent. "Check over there," James muttered, his voice low but commanding. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She had seconds, maybe less. Her mind raced for a way out, but she was trapped. If she ran, they'd see her. If she stayed, they'd find her. Then she heard Daniel's voice. "It's nothing. Probably a stray cat." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. Something almost forced. James wasn't convinced. "You sure about that?" There was a tense pause, then Daniel sighed. "I'll check." Emily's stomach twisted. Footsteps moved closer, the sound of expensive shoes crunching on gravel. She could feel him approaching, could sense his presence just feet away. Then silence. The weight of it was unbearable. She braced herself, expecting the worst. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps retreated. "Nothing here," Daniel called out. Emily's breath caught in her throat. He had seen her. She knew it, felt it, but he had chosen to let her go. Why? "Let's go," Daniel said, his voice steady. James hesitated, but after a moment, she heard the sound of car doors opening, engines rumbling to life. A few seconds later, the vehicles pulled away, their headlights cutting through the darkness before disappearing down the road. Emily didn't move, not for a long time. Her legs were shaking, her entire body numb with fear. Daniel had protected her, but not out of love. There was something else behind his decision, something she didn't understand yet. Finally, when she was sure she was alone, she forced herself to stand. Her mind screamed at her to run, to leave, to pretend none of this had happened. But she couldn't. Not now. She had to know the truth. Swallowing hard, she made her way to the door Daniel had walked through earlier. It was unlocked now, left slightly ajar. An invitation or a warning. Emily pushed it open. What she saw inside made her breath catch, and in that moment, she realized this wasn't just Daniel's secret. It was something much, much worse. Emily stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The room was dimly lit, filled with old wooden crates and dusty furniture. It didn't look like anything special, just an abandoned storage space, or so she thought. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, something caught her eye. A large, heavy metal door in the back corner of the room, slightly cracked open. The door was different from everything else in the space. It was new, out of place, and her curiosity pulled her toward it like a magnet. She moved toward it cautiously, every step echoing louder in the silence. There was something about this place that felt wrong, like an abandoned house with a secret, and she had a sinking feeling she was about to uncover it. When she pushed the door open, the harsh, cold light that flooded the small room nearly blinded her. She squinted, trying to make sense of the scene before her. It was a small, sterile space, with concrete floors and walls lined with filing cabinets. But it wasn't the room itself that made her stomach churn. It was what she saw inside the cabinets. Dozens of files, each labeled with names, addresses, and dates, many of them with pictures attached. Some were crossed out with red ink, others circled in black. Emily's heart raced as she scanned the names, all unfamiliar to her, but one stood out, her own. The file had her full name on it, along with a picture of her, one she hadn't seen in years, taken when she was just a teenager. It was a snapshot from her first job, the one she had completely forgotten about until now. There were other details on the page too, things she didn't understand, numbers, locations, strange codes that made no sense. And then, just beneath her file, there was another name, James Carter. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. James wasn't just an old acquaintance, he was connected to Daniel. But how? Why? The room seemed to close in on her. As she stepped back from the cabinets, her foot hit something on the floor, sending a small object skidding across the concrete. She froze, eyes locked on it. It was a key, rusted and old, but unmistakable. A key to the very door she had just entered. Emily's mind raced. Was this part of Daniel's plan all along? Was she being watched? And before she could even begin to make sense of what was happening, a voice broke the silence behind her. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily." It was Daniel. Emily spun around, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Daniel. His expression was cold, unreadable, like a mask had slipped into place over the man she thought she knew. Her heart hammered in her chest, and the key she had found fell from her trembling fingers, clinking as it hit the concrete floor. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily." His voice was low, like he had been expecting this moment, prepared for it. And in that instant, the realization hit her harder than a slap. This was no accident. She wasn't just some confused woman who stumbled onto something she shouldn't have. Daniel had known all along. "Why, Daniel? Why all of this?" Emily's voice trembled, but there was anger too, a deep, consuming rage that burned through her fear. "Who are you?" Daniel didn't immediately answer. Instead, he walked further into the room, eyes never leaving hers. "You've been asking too many questions, Emily," he said quietly. "I had to make sure you wouldn't dig too deep." The weight of his words crashed over her. You've been lying to me from the start, haven't you?" Her voice broke. Everything. Everything was a lie. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. He didn't need to. It was all so painfully clear now. "I was trying to protect you," he said. The words clipped, like he was reciting a script he had rehearsed. "But you don't understand what's at stake." "Protect me," Emily echoed bitterly. "By keeping secrets from me? By putting me in danger? What is all this? What does James have to do with it?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he opened them again, there was something in his gaze, something dark and final. "James isn't just an old friend, Emily. He's a business partner. We're involved in something bigger than you could ever imagine. And now you're part of it too." The truth slammed into her like a wave. Emily could barely comprehend what he was saying. "What do you mean, involved?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What are you really doing, Daniel?" He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his voice dropping to a near growl. "We're not just businessmen, Emily. We're part of something illegal. I've been working undercover for years. James, he's my contact. We've been gathering intel, running operations, and you—" He hesitated, his eyes flickering for just a second. "You were never supposed to get caught up in this." Emily took a step back, her mind reeling, trying to process the magnitude of his confession. And then, as if everything had been building to this one single moment, Daniel added, "And now, I have no choice but to make sure you stay silent. For good." The weight of his words sank in slowly, and for the first time, Emily realized just how deep she had gotten into this tangled web. But what happened next was even more shocking than anything Daniel could have prepared her for. Just as Daniel reached out to grab her, a gunshot rang out from the doorway. Daniel froze, his hand faltering inches from her arm. James Carter appeared in the doorway, gun in hand. "You think you can walk away from this?" James sneered, eyes narrowing at Daniel. Emily stood frozen, her heart racing as the chaos unfolded before her eyes. The world seemed to stand still as Emily watched James hold the gun steady, his eyes locked on Daniel. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved anger. Daniel stood frozen, his expression hardening as he realized the gravity of the situation. "You're making a mistake, James," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. There was no defiance, just resignation, a man who knew the game was over. "I did what I had to do." James didn't flinch. "You think I don't know that?" He took a step closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. "But the thing is, Daniel, you never should have dragged her into this. She was never part of the plan." Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. She had been living in a lie, trapped in a dangerous world she didn't even understand. But now, standing in the middle of it, she realized she didn't have a choice but to fight for her life, for the truth, for the future she had yet to live. Before she could even think, she heard the unmistakable sound of sirens wailing in the distance, growing louder by the second. James looked toward the door, his eyes narrowing as he cursed under his breath. He didn't have much time. Daniel, seizing the moment of distraction, lunged forward, grabbing James's arm. The gun went off, but the shot missed, striking the concrete wall behind them. Emily screamed, her heart racing as chaos erupted in front of her. The two men struggled, grappling for control, but the sound of approaching law enforcement was enough to change the tide. In one fluid motion, Daniel knocked the gun from James's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. The sirens were deafening now, and within seconds, police officers burst through the door, rushing to subdue James and arrest him. Daniel stood frozen, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. Emily took a hesitant step forward. "Why, Daniel? Why did you lie to me?" Her voice cracked with the weight of the betrayal. Daniel's eyes met hers, but there was no answer, just an empty apology in his gaze. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The man she had married, the man she thought she knew, was a stranger, and in that moment, she understood. He had never been the man he pretended to be. He was part of a dangerous world she never should have entered. As the police led James away in handcuffs, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, knowing the truth was finally out. But it wasn't just the truth about Daniel. It was the truth about herself. She wasn't the naive girl who had married a millionaire. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to take control of her own life. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Daniel was arrested and charged with several crimes, including fraud and conspiracy. James, too, was facing his own charges. The life Emily had built with him was shattered, but she was free. And as she sat on the porch of the house they had once shared, watching the sun set on the horizon, she realized that sometimes the truth wasn't just painful, it was the key to freedom. Emily didn't need to look back. She was moving forward, stronger than she had ever been before, knowing that the life she was meant to live had only just begun. As the final chapter of her past closed, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that despite the darkness, the light had found its way back to her, and she was ready for whatever came next.